Hey, welcome. Today we're taking a look at a Fox News segment that took two violent attacks, both happening on the same afternoon, and tied them to a huge political fight going on in Washington. So how exactly did they connect the dots? Let's get into it.
So, the whole conversation got kicked off by two really alarming events. First, you had a gunman open fire at Old Dominion University in Virginia. And then, just a few hours later, in Michigan, a man drove his car right into a synagogue. These two things happening so close together really set the stage for a much bigger discussion.
So yeah, how does a news panel take a university shooting and an attack on a synagogue and weave them together? That's really the heart of what we're looking at here. We're going to break down how the commentators link these acts to everything from the criminal justice system to a major funding battle in Congress and even to big questions about American citizenship itself.
Okay, first things first. Let's just lay out the basic facts of these two incidents, at least as they were reported in the segment. You kind of have to understand what happened to get why the analysis went in the direction it did.
What's really interesting here is how the panel immediately started drawing parallels between the two attackers. I mean, as you can see, both were naturalized citizens, which means they weren't born here, but became U.S. citizens later. The suspect in Virginia, he had a previous conviction for supporting ISIS. Meanwhile, the attacker in Michigan was apparently motivated by a recent military strike that killed his relatives. And while both attacks were stopped, this shared background of the suspects, well, that became a huge focus of the panel's discussion.
And you know, a really big part of the segment was about the heroism at Old Dominion. The panel made sure to highlight an FBI statement that praised the ROTC members who actually confronted and took down the shooter. Their actions were credited with saving lives, and the commentators kept coming back to it as this moment of incredible bravery in the middle of a tragedy.
All right, so we've got the what happened. Now let's get into the so what, at least according to the panel. They didn't just report on the events, they analyzed them, weaving them into these bigger national issues. And this is where their argument really starts to take shape.
So, the first big link they made, it was all about the criminal justice system. They really zeroed in on the background of the Old Dominion University shooter, arguing it was a critical and they said preventable part of the story.
And here's the number that was at the center of it: 7. The shooter, who'd been convicted for providing material support to ISIS, was sentenced to 11 years in prison. But he was released after serving only 7. One panelist argued that this early release, which they called a result of a lenient approach to justice, made the whole deadly attack preventable. That framing puts the responsibility, in their view, squarely on past policy decisions.
The second connection they drew was all about timing. It turns out these attacks happened right as Democrats in Congress voted to block a funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security. The panel absolutely seized on this coincidence to make a much broader point about national security.
And then the panel pointed to this statement to really drive their point home. The day after voting against that DHS funding bill, a Michigan Congresswoman, Elissa Slotkin, whose district is near where the synagogue attack happened, said this. The panel immediately presented her comment as a changed tune, basically suggesting the attack forced her to reverse her position on DHS funding. It's a really potent narrative, especially during a big budget fight in Congress.
To add a little more weight to that point, the show played a clip of the former DHS secretary, Jay Johnson. He was basically explaining that the department is about way more than just immigration. As you can see, he laid out how its funding impacts a whole range of critical missions, everything from keeping airports and ports secure to cybersecurity and even the Secret Service. All things, he said, that are essential for keeping all of us safe.
Okay, their third big argument zeroed in on that common thread between the two attackers. They were both naturalized U.S. citizens who, according to the panel, held beliefs that were hostile to the United States. And this led to a whole discussion about the very nature of American citizenship.
This quote from one of the panelists pretty much sums up their whole argument. The point being made was that citizenship isn't some absolute guaranteed right. They were suggesting that if an individual is ideologically against the United States or acts as an enemy of the state, they shouldn't get to keep the privilege of being an American citizen.
So, what did all of this add up to? Well, the panel took all these separate arguments and wove them into this one single overarching conclusion about where American security stands right now.
To really underscore this feeling of urgency, one panelist dropped this pretty startling figure. They attributed it to the director of the Counterterrorism Center, saying that 18,000 known or suspected terrorists have entered the country. This number was used to frame these two attacks not as just isolated random events, but as symptoms of a much bigger, more immediate threat.
And here it is, the whole thing brought together. For the Outnumbered panel, these are not separate problems.
They made the case that a lenient justice system, active terror cells, a rise in anti-Semitism, a culture they see as being too tolerant of extremism, and even wars happening overseas are all deeply connected. In their view, nothing is unrelated when it comes to creating what they called a heightened threat environment for the country.
And all of that leaves us with this final question. As we've seen through the lens of just this one news segment, events can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, connecting dots between crime, policy, and culture. It really pushes us to ask, in a world where threats feel more and more complex and interconnected, what does real security actually look like, and how do we even get there?